biologist, a man who supposedly worked alongside future Nobel laureates, and, according to the story, a man who was shown something in a locked room at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base that he would not speak of for a decade. This story reached prominent American UFO investigator Leonard Stringfield by way of France through a couple of intermediaries before he ever wrote it down and published it. I'll walk you through just enough of that background info so you know where this account came from. And then I want to spend most of the episode inside the account itself, because underneath all that secondhand testimony is a very specific, very strange first-person experience. A man walked into a room and saw something. I think it's more likely than not that something true underpins this story, even if a name or two got changed before the account reached Stringfield's desk. So I'd ask you to take this at face value for now. Consider the account as it was related to Stringfield. Leonard Stringfield spent most of his working life in Cincinnati in public relations, but for 4 decades he was also one of the best connected men in American ufology. Air Force liaison for work in the 1950s, PR for a national UFO group under Major Donald Keyhoe, a role on the government's Condon Committee, and eventually a seat on MUFON's national board. That 1978 paper, cataloging reports of recovered alien bodies, helped make Stringfield the person to reach out to if you had a body story to tell. This report from France reached Stringfield not long after that. In 1980, Stringfield was put in touch with a French researcher, Dr. John Gille, affiliated with France's National Scientific Research Center, roughly France's equivalent of NASA. Gille had spent 2 years quietly chasing down a story he'd first heard from a man named Jean-Charles Fumeau, head of a small UFO group in the south of France. Fumeau's original tale involved 2 UFOs crashing into a French marsh. But buried inside that account was a name, a professor who Fumeau claimed had gotten a first-hand look at what came out of the wreckage. Gille ran that name down. It led him to a teacher in France named Leonard Visse. And Gille sat across from Visse in Visse's home and asked him point blank, had he participated in an alien autopsy? Visse's response was quiet, flat, and calm. It was a denial. But the fashion in which he responded to this extraordinary question was itself telling to Gille. And then Visse said something that Gille couldn't shake. He told him that everything Gille had just described, the biology of it, was quote-unquote perfectly true. Not that he'd seen it himself, just that whoever had described it clearly knew real anatomy and real exobiology. That's the pivot point. From here, I want to stop treating this as a researcher's investigation and start looking at it like Visse's story, if it had happened exactly as described. By 1959, the man behind this story had spent years narrowly focused on one subject: histones, small proteins that help package and control DNA inside a cell. It's obscure work, but he was, by the account, among the best in the world at it. That year, an American scientific organization invited him to the United States for a 3-month lecture tour. Routine, prestigious, unremarkable, he accepted. Partway through the tour, an American colleague, a fellow biologist he'd corresponded with for years, asked him if he'd run a specific experiment measuring histone weight in a set of unidentified cells. It was exactly his specialty. He said yes. This is where it turns. He thought he was getting on another routine domestic flight to another university. Instead, he was put on a U.S. Air Force shuttle plane, and he landed inside a military compound, the Foreign Technology Division of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. If you've gotten this far in the video, it'd mean a lot to me if you'd consider hitting like, subscribe, or even leaving a comment. He was surprised to find himself on a military base at all, but nobody explained why, and he had a job to do. A full staff and every piece of equipment he needed were already waiting for him. He ran the Histone measurement. The result was almost absurd, a number far lower than anything he'd ever recorded in a human cell, lower than seemed possible. Any scientist's first instinct here is to assume he made a mistake. So that's what he assumed. He ran it again. Same result. If he was right, then either his instruments had failed him twice, or 20 years of genetic theory needed to be rewritten. So he made a request most people in his position never would have had to make. He asked to see the organism the cells had come from. They said yes. He was taken into a special room, one built, it seemed, for exactly this kind of leisurely, undisturbed study. And there, laid out for him, were two bodies. His first impression of the partially mutilated bodies was a mundane one, victims of a car accident, perhaps, until he looked closer. Height, about 7 feet, 3 inches, the size of the tallest American basketball player. The heads were intact, high, broad foreheads, long blonde hair. The eyes were stretched toward the temples, giving the faces something like an Asian cast. Small nose, small mouth, thin and precisely delineated lips. No beard on either face. And despite small differences, the two of them looked almost like twins. He was a geneticist, not a coroner. So the details that truly stood out to him weren't the size or shape. It was what was underneath the skin. The bodies had been kept in formalin, and still, the skin stayed perfectly white, no tan at all, which told him something. No keratin granules, none of the pigment response human skin uses after sun exposure. He looked for a blood system and didn't find one working the way ours does. Instead, a lymphatic system, dominant, doing work our own bodies split between two systems. The hands were slender but unmistakably human-like. The eyes, a very light blue, weren't so different from ours either. But the feet, small-toed and completely flat, were nothing like a human foot at all. And then, according to the account, his American colleague leaned in and told him bluntly, what he'd been looking at, the two bodies, they were not of this earth. The account says he was appalled, and in the same breath, relieved. His genetic theories hadn't failed him. 20 years of research hadn't ended in failure. Something else entirely had walked through the door of his understanding of biology. Before he left, 2 members of American security had him swear to silence for 10 years. He flew home to Paris without incident, and he kept his word. Sometime around 1969, a decade later, he finally told the story, quietly, to a small group of his own students. Which brings us back to that house in central France, and Leon Visse, sitting across from Dr. Gille, denying he was ever in that room. Remember what Visse said next, almost like he couldn't help himself. Only a biologist of really big caliber could imagine a description of the body of an extraterrestrial alien which so accurately fits with the great principles of modern biology and exobiology. Visse went further, unprompted, explaining in detail why a dominant lymphatic system would make sense for a long-distance space traveler, why reduced muscle and cardiovascular demands would make sense for a species built for almost no gravity at all. He wasn't guessing, he was elaborating. Visse pointed Gille toward the one way to actually check the story, the scientific team the real professor was said to have worked beside, the 1965 Nobel Prize-winning trio of Jacques Monod, Francois Jacob, and André Lwoff. Gille met Lwoff in person in October 1979, and Lwoff shut it down immediately. No knowledge of any Visse working as a biologist. No knowledge of the affair at all. Flying saucers, he said, don't exist. Swamp gas, weather balloons, misidentification. A giant dead end. And for the most part, that's where the paper trail ends. This is the COMETA report, published in 1999. French military and intelligence officials spent nearly 3 years studying UFOs and concluded that the extraterrestrial hypothesis was the likeliest explanation for a meaningful share of their cases. The COMETA report sat mostly ignored for decades, until 2026, when it was included in one of the Department of War's UAP file releases. This led me to page 105 of Stringfield's book. I have hesitated a long time before publishing this amazing story, which will bring down all the French scientists' wrath upon me, particularly from those who work in our official GIPAN. That's Jean-Charles Fumeau, who first published the story about Visse and the dead alien twins, explaining why he almost didn't publish. GIPAN was France's official government UFO research body, the very institution COMETA grew out of. 2 tracks running through French ufology at once, an official one that wanted nothing to do with body stories, and an underground one trading them anyway. COMETA leans on radar tracks and corroborated testimony. When it does touch an alien body story, it's in its Roswell appendix, and it's openly skeptical. Yet both threads trace back to the same place, the Foreign Technology Division of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which underscores the importance of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to the global UFO controversy. I don't think this is a story invented from whole cloth. I think there are kernels of truth in it. A real French scientist, a real trip to Ohio, a real decade of silence. I do think it's possible that in the retelling, a name or two got changed, perhaps deliberately, to protect someone that was still alive. Whether that man was really Leon Visse, I don't think we'll ever know for certain. But the room he described, the 2 bodies, the lymphatic system, the flat, small feet, the moment his own life's work stopped making sense and then quietly started making sense again, that's the part of this account I keep coming back to. It doesn't read like a hoax dressed up with borrowed Nobel names. It reads like a man trying, 30 years later, to explain something he still doesn't have better words for. Thanks for joining Catskill Liminal Walk. If you've got ideas for topics for me to cover in future episodes, please do leave a comment. I'd really appreciate that. And I'd love to hear any feedback you have about this episode. Again, thanks for joining, and I hope to see you next time.